John Bernard Connors was born around 1892 or 1893. He had spent his working life as a dentist in Neath, practicing from a property on Lewis Road that served both as his home and his surgery for many years. He was, by the time of his death, a man who had dedicated the better part of his life to serving the people of the town he had made his own. Neath is a market town in South Wales, sitting in the valley of the River Neath, flanked by the coalfields to the north and the coastline to the south. In the 1970s, it was a community with deep roots, a working town where people knew their neighbours, where the same families had lived in the same streets for generations, and where a man's reputation was built slowly and kept carefully. The town had a strong industrial heritage. Coal, steel, and tin plate had shaped the lives of its people for over a century. The streets around the town centre were familiar and well-worn. Stockham's Corner, Lewis Road, the shadow of the old penny brick church. The Royal British Legion Club was a gathering place for men who had worked hard and wanted somewhere comfortable to sit with a friend and a drink at the end of the day. Neath in the late 1970s was not a wealthy town, but it was a town that took care of its own. People looked out for each other. They noticed things. They knew who belonged and who did not. Community life in Neath in those years revolved around the familiar anchors: the pub, the club, the chapel, the market. Families lived close together and children played in streets they knew. There was a sense of belonging that ran through the town. It was a place where an old man walking slowly to the Legion for a drink with friends was part of the natural rhythm of things, and where his absence would be noticed. John Bernard Connors was part of that rhythm. By 1978, he was 85 years old and retired. He had long since stopped practicing dentistry, but he remained at his home on Lewis Road, the same property where he had once seen patients. His wife Agnes, with whom he had shared that home for many years, had in recent years moved into a residential hospital as her health declined. John lived alone. He had done so for approximately 5 years. He was a frail man by the end. A neighbour named Wyndham Jones described him plainly, so thin you could have pushed him over with a feather, he said. He was like a skeleton. John had been unwell in the months before his death. Despite his frailty, he maintained his routine. He was known at the Royal British Legion Club, where he went regularly for a drink with close friends, among them Philip Knight and George Hopkins. He was not a man who made a fuss of himself. He kept himself to himself. But those who knew him well. Philip Knight, one of his closest friends, was the last person known to have seen John Bernard Connors alive. When asked how John had seemed, Knight said simply that he had looked champion. John had money. Not in the house, he was careful with it, keeping it invested and in the bank. But it was known in certain quarters that a retired dentist living alone on Lewis Road was not a man without means. A friend reflected later that whoever had gone to that house had gone there looking for cash, believing it would be kept at home. It was not. But the belief that it might be there was enough. By 1978, Neath, like many South Wales towns, was feeling the pressures of a difficult decade. Industries that had once sustained whole communities were in decline. Unemployment was rising. For some, times were hard. For some, the sight of a frail old man living alone in a large property on Lewis Road, a man known to have money, was a temptation that overrode everything else. Sometime on the afternoon or evening of Thursday 30th of March 1978, John Bernard Connors was murdered in his own home. His body was found by his home help, who raised the alarm. A post-mortem examination established that John had been beaten repeatedly about the head with 2 different blunt objects. The force of the blows had been savage. Injuries to his hands showed that despite his age and his frailty, he had tried to defend himself. Death had been swift. The detective in charge of the investigation stood in that house on Lewis Road and described the scene as possibly as vicious as anything I have seen. The disturbing thing, he added, was the obvious premeditation. The 2 blunt objects used to kill John Bernard Connors were never found. Sniffer dogs searched gardens and drains across the surrounding area in the hope of recovering them. They were not recovered. As the investigation took shape, 2 figures emerged as the primary persons of interest. The first was a woman. At lunchtime on the day of the murder, several hours before John died, a woman had been seen standing in the doorway of his house on Lewis Road. She was described as middle-aged, approximately 5 feet 5 inches tall, of broad build and wearing a black coat and dark-rimmed glasses. The press quickly dubbed her the Woman in Black. Earlier that same day, she had been seen sitting in the Café Royale on Stockham's Corner, just yards from John's house, in the company of 2 men in their 20s. Detectives developed a theory that the woman had been acting as a lookout or informant for whoever carried out the attack. They believed she had gone to the door to confirm that John lived alone, that he was elderly and frail, and that a visit later in the day would go unchallenged. The woman in black was never identified. The second figure was the man who became known as the Running Man. At around 7:15 in the evening on the night of the killing, a man was seen running from John's house at speed. He sprinted from the property and threw himself into the back of a waiting white car. The car accelerated away towards Stockham's Corner, almost colliding with another vehicle before driving off at speed. No one caught the registration plate. The running man was described as between 30 and 40 years old, approximately 6 feet tall, and wearing a light brown or tan-coloured shirt with the sleeves rolled up, a dark waistcoat, and grey trousers. A police sketch of his face was produced from witness descriptions and published widely in newspapers and on television across Wales. Detective Chief Inspector Brooks, the officer leading the inquiry, was unambiguous. He stated publicly, "That's the one we want. I'm quite satisfied it's him." The running man became the primary suspect in the murder of John Bernard Connors. He has never been identified. The investigation that followed was one of the largest South Wales police had mounted for a murder inquiry in Neath. Door-to-door inquiries were carried out across the town and the surrounding area. Over the 12 months that followed, approximately 6,000 people were interviewed. A huge number of witness statements were gathered and cross-referenced. Every lead was followed. One unexpected thread emerged when detectives established that a group of antique dealers from Portsmouth had been in Neath town centre on the day of the murder, canvassing door to door and handing out leaflets. Welsh officers were dispatched to Hampshire to track them down. 6 travelling traders were identified, returned to Neath, and questioned at length. That line of inquiry led nowhere. On the first anniversary of John's murder, police staged a public reconstruction of the events on and around Lewis Road. A man dressed in clothing similar to that of the running man retraced the route from John's house towards Stockham's Corner, in the hope that seeing the scene recreated would prompt someone who had been there that night to come forward. No one came forward. The case went cold. 30 years later, South Wales Police reopened the investigation. A DNA profile had been obtained from material recovered at the original crime scene. An incident room was established at Port Talbot Police Station. Detective Sergeant Paul Geese of the South Wales Police Major Crime Investigation Team led the cold case review, employing the latest forensic techniques available to his team. Despite the DNA profile and despite the advances in forensic science, no breakthrough came. The running man and the woman in black remained unidentified. John's family spoke when the cold case review was announced. They said, "The pain is still with us today. We believe that someone out there knows what happened to our father and grandfather. Time has been no healer for the family, and we want to see justice for John, which would allow us to grieve for him." John Bernard Connors was 85 years old. He had given his working life to the people of Neath. He was frail and unwell, and living quietly alone in the house where he had once practiced dentistry, going to the Legion Club for a drink with his friends, and keeping his money carefully in the bank. On the afternoon or evening of Thursday 30th of March 1978, someone came to his door, entered his home, and beat him to death. They left with whatever they had come for. They drove away in a white car from Stockham's Corner and were never seen again. The murder of John Bernard Connors has never been solved. Hello everyone, thank you for listening, and drop any feedback below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I hope to see you again in the next case right here on Cold Case UK.